Hi, I'm Tiffany. Welcome to Towering TBR. If you're new, I am chronically ill and I read a wide variety of books. Lately, though, I haven't been able to stick to a TBR. I have just only been able to mood read. My mood has been very strong. So I allowed booktubers I watch to influence me to pick up my next read. Four of them went really well, and one was really not to my taste, and I had to DNF it. So, without any further ado, let's get to the first book. So, this first book didn't take one person influencing me, not two, but three people influenced me to pick up this book. This is a horror novel, and I do not read horror novels for two reasons. One, I deal with a lot of anxiety, and sometimes reading a horror book is just adding to the anxiety. And two, I have a chronic illness that makes me perpetually nauseated. And so, gory scenes, especially, can just make me sick. But I had heard so much good stuff about this book that I was convinced to pick it up. I first heard about it from Brianna over at Four Paws in a Book. She loved it, gave it 5 stars, but we don't have a ton in overlap, so I was aware of it, but not yet ready to pick it up. And then I saw Becca over at Read Becca talk about it, and she talked about the themes and how timely they are about the algorithm and AI determining art. And that just sounded really fascinating, but I was still just not quite sure of it. But then I saw one of my favorite authors, Jenny Lawson, on her social media, and she was praising it. She gave it 5 stars as well. So I thought, you know what? Let's give it a try. I mean, if it's too gory, I'll just DNF it. And that's fine. But I'm really glad I gave it a chance because I'm a little over halfway and I'm really enjoying it so far. So we're following Misha. He is the writer of a very popular TV series, and he has been building tension between his two female leads, and he wants them to be out and proud. However, he gets called to the studio, and they're like, sorry, the algorithm says that you need to kill off one of your gay characters. And he doesn't want to tell that story. He wants to talk about queer joy and not always queer trauma. Like, bury your gays is a trope that is so common because apparently queer trauma sells. And that's essentially what he's told. You either need to make your characters straight, or if they're going to be gay, you got to kill off at least one of them. And yeah, he's like, I'm not going to do that. This is my story, and this is how I want to tell it. And but then strange things start happening. He is primarily a horror writer, and some of his creatures and his baddies, I guess, start coming to life and start stalking him and haunting him. And it's really eerie and spooky. We have had one gory scene, but fortunately, I was able to just kind of get past it. And yeah, I feel like the themes are definitely quite timely and saying a lot about, if you take humanity out of art, does it even mean anything? And it's anti-capitalist also in that art doesn't have to sell well to make it good art. And yeah, I'm really enjoying it. It is pretty campy, which I think is helping me. It's not quite as gory as I was thinking it might be, so that was helpful. Also, this audiobook has multiple narrators, and TJ Klune, Stephen Graham Jones, T. Kingfisher. I think there's a few more, but it's really making the audiobook quite a good experience. And I'm glad I'm reading it that way. It's also a little bit darkly funny, which I'm enjoying. I think that's helping me not get too scared is when there are, bits of dark humor. So I am going to finish it up and I will check in and let you know my final thoughts on this book and what I'm influenced to pick up next. So I finished reading Bury Your Gaze and I'm giving it 4 stars. There were some gory scenes that I did have to push past, and but I think it was worth it. I think the message of the book was really important. I love the questions it brought up, like who owns your likeness and what are they allowed to do with it? I loved the anti capitalist themes and the dangers of AI destroying art. If you take out the humanity, then is it really worth anything? Overall, I thought it was an important read. It was also campy and fun, and I'm glad I read it. So, I have had this on my TBR for a really long time. I got this little mass market paperback copy at a library sale several years ago. But I was watching Audrey over at Audrey Approved recently, and she was talking about her favorite nonfiction writers, and John Krakauer made her list. And this is his best known. And uh, she really talked him up, and I got really excited to read him. So I have prioritized this. Um, it actually worked out really nicely with the timing because we are getting a big snowstorm. And so I think that's going to definitely add to the atmosphere of an Everest disaster. So, this author is an investigative journalist, and he is commissioned to write a piece about mountain climbing guides and the commercialization of climbing Mount Everest. Basically, you don't have to necessarily be a mountaineer to climb Everest as long as you have enough money. You can pay people to get you up there. And instead of just writing that piece, John Krakauer decides that he, an experienced mountaineer, would like to actually climb Mount Everest using a guide to then have a more informed piece. And so that's what he does. He decides to climb Mount Everest, and we hear about his experience and the disastrous storm that killed several people. So it starts off with his summit, and quite honestly, it sounds pretty awful. By the time he got to the top of Mount Everest, he was exhausted, starving, muddled in the head from the lack of oxygen, and like honestly, it sounded like he didn't even enjoy that part, like the view and the reaching your goal part. And I'm gonna quote what he says. But now that I was finally here, actually standing on the summit of Mount Everest, I just couldn't summon the energy to care. And as he's descending, he sees clouds starting to roll in. And I love the way he writes with such tension. He says, "None of us imagined what a horrible ordeal was drawing nigh. Nobody suspected that by the end of that long day, every minute would matter." And I was instantly pulled in. So he talks about sort of the history of Mount Everest and how Sherpas, these people who live in this area and are acclimatized to higher altitude, have been working as guides pretty much since the beginning. And one of the reasons they want to be a Sherpa is because it pays 10 times the annual salary for just 1 to 2 months of grueling work. So it is grueling and it is risky, but they can make a lot of money relatively there. But unfortunately, it is quite deadly. One third of all Mount Everest deaths are Sherpas. The Western companies that utilize their help often treat them quite poorly. And that was something he noted with the company that he was going with. They wanted to make sure they treated their Sherpas well. And in this scenario, as they were getting there, one of their Sherpas had actually fallen down a 150 feet crevasse. And he had to be basically hauled out by other people and basically hauled down to base camp because the helicopters can't fly that high. And so, yeah, he was seriously injured and evacuated to get medical care. So, when he was talking about base camp, it just sounds gross. It is super nasty. So, they don't have enough toilets for all of these people. And so, basically, people just defecate anywhere. Like, it's so gross. Let me read what he said about it. Huge stinking piles of human feces lay everywhere. It was impossible not to walk in it. The river of snowmelt meandering through the center of the settlement was an open sewer. And I thought, ew, gross. Like, mm. Lastly, I don't know if this would bother other people, but like, this is a true story, and he is talking about real people. And twice he has described real people in very insulting ways. One he described as a hatchet faced beekeeper from Auckland, and another he described as wiry, hard partying man with a prematurely weathered face that brought to mind an old football. Eh, rude. Like, that did kind of irritate me. But this is written very compelling. It's almost like a thriller. And, like, this is what he's known for, is narrative nonfiction, telling a really good story that is based on facts. And I'm enjoying it. Like, I actually am really ready to pick it back up and get to it because, yeah, I know people are gonna die, and I know that he's gonna make it through, but I don't really know any of the particulars, and I definitely want to learn. So, I'm going to keep reading this, and I'm so thankful that Audrey insisted insisted I get to it because this is a really good read so far. All right, so I have finished Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, and I'm going to give it 4 stars. This was really good. Audrey and I have very similar reading tastes, and especially in nonfiction. So when she loved this, I was pretty sure I was going to love it as well. I will say John Krakauer is a very skilled writer. He really created the atmosphere of cold and exhaustion and just this biting wind and like the muddled thoughts he was getting when he was hypoxic. And it was really riveting. And it was almost like I was there. And not that I ever was going to climb mountains, but this sounds like a really miserable experience. I don't understand why people do it. I learned you can get frostbite on your eyes, which, oh, that sounds awful. I will say, so this book was written in 1996. The audiobook was then created in 1997, and the audiobook is just kind of meh. He does do a couple of accents when he's talking about people from New Zealand or South Africa, but it's fine. It doesn't really add anything. I think this story is really great on its own, and I needed the audiobook for accommodation, but I wouldn't particularly recommend this one. I really liked having the book alongside my reading because there are things like maps and different like locations on the mountain and pictures of the people who perished. So this was a riveting read. I'm really glad I picked it up and prioritized it. And I would definitely recommend reading in winter or whenever it's really cold and snowy for you, because that just really lent it the right atmosphere. So one of the reasons the disaster happened the way it did was people who climb Mount Everest are incredibly dogged and determined. And the people who were guiding them told them that they would have to turn back at a certain time. But getting that close to the peak and just turning around, they didn't want to do that. And the guides were reminding them that, getting to the top is only half the job. You have to get back down alive. And some people who decided to push past and not turn around were then caught out in the open in a blizzard. And unfortunately, many of them lost their lives. I definitely think this was a great book, and I definitely want to pick out more John Krakauer. So for book 3, I am picking Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. I wasn't planning on picking up this book because I didn't like his first book, All the Light You Cannot See. I DNF'd that around the halfway point, which I think it was like a 500-page book. So I was pretty far into it, but we were following these 2 characters. They hadn't intertwined yet, and I just didn't care. So I wasn't planning to pick up anything else he was writing. But when I heard Gemma over at Gemma Books talk about it and praise it so highly and mention that she didn't like his first book either, or at least that book. I don't know if it's his first book. It gave me the confidence to give him another try. So I will be picking up Cloud Cuckoo Land as my 3rd influenced book, and I will come back to you when I have some thoughts on it. Hey, so I have read 20% of Cloud Cuckoo Land, and I'm really enjoying it. I did see Gemma and Jack in their conversation talking about how long this book was, but because I got it on ebook, I didn't quite realize it was over 600 pages. So I'm glad I didn't know because sometimes bigger books intimidate me. Right now, we have met several characters. We have a character in a future timeline where she is on a generation spaceship going somewhere. We have 2 characters back in the 1400s, and we also have a timeline in the current timeline, and we have a character who's about to bomb a library. And then we kind of get pieces of their lives. Right now, they all kind of hinge upon this ancient story, Cloud Cuckoo Land. It kind of reminded me of the Princess Bride book because if you read the Princess Bride book, you know that the character in the book is looking for a copy of the book to give to their child. And that's sort of what this is, except like on steroids. There is this ancient story of Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is not real. But it is real in these timelines that we're talking about with the characters and basically how they associate like with the story. I'm really liking the present timeline story probably the most because we're in a library and we're focused on these children who are going to put together the Cloud Cuckoo Land as like a play. And then we also have the intrigue of the person who is trying to bomb the library. He's a very interesting character. He's likely on the autism spectrum, from the way that he's been described, and he's obsessed with owls. I'm seeing lots of repeating bird type themes in this book. All that to say, I really like the character work. I really like the writing. I feel like my judgment and my enjoyment is really going to hinge on how he brings these stories together. That was something I had a problem with in his other book is by the 50% mark, our characters hadn't yet met or influenced one another. And so I guess I don't know how the story's going to pull together, but I'm intrigued and I definitely like some timelines better than others, but I feel like all of the characters are pretty interesting so far. I'm going to keep reading it and I will let you know my thoughts when I finish it. I'm hoping to read 2 more books in this vlog, and I've got a couple that I feel influenced to pick up, but I'm also allowing for my mood to change and to pick up different stuff. I haven't listened to Gemma and Jack's conversation entirely because obviously they discuss spoilers, but I've got that saved so that after I finish the book, I can then listen to their complete thoughts. Okay, so I have finally finished Cloud Cuckoo Land, and I really enjoyed it. It was a bit of a ride, though. Last I checked in, I was about 20% of the way in, and I was enjoying it. I think I mentioned that there are 3 timelines and 4 perspectives. So we have 2 people in the timeline of like the 1400s, we have a current timeline in 2020, and then we have a future timeline sometime in the future. We don't know exactly when. And I actually, shortly after I gave you my update, I thought I was going to DNF this book. The 1400s past timeline is definitely the least interesting, and I felt like the pace was much slower in that section than in the other sections. And so, yeah, I was like, am I going to DNF this too? But I decided to just give it a couple of days and keep going, and I'm really glad I stuck with it because I felt like the book was worth it in the end. I think this book is very much like a mosaic. There's a lot of pieces that connect, but you don't know how until much later in the story, and I really liked it. I definitely think this is a good book club book because there's just so much to pick through and to dig, and I enjoyed the epic old poem or story that basically all of the characters were somehow related to, and overall, I just really enjoyed it. I will say that I found something quite interesting in the future timeline, and it really got me quite interested in preferring that timeline, but you don't get a whole lot of answers in the future timeline, and I feel like it was a little bit lacking. I wish we would have gotten a little bit more answers in the future. And I will talk to you when I start my next book. Hey, so before I talk about my next book, I had a couple more thoughts I wanted to add to Cloud Cuckoo Land. So I neglected to tell you about the audiobook, which I thought was really good. So there are 2 narrators for Cloud Cuckoo Land, a guy named Simon Jones. He narrates just the original story of Cloud Cuckoo Land. And Marin Ireland, she narrates all of the other perspectives, both men and women. And while I thought both of them were good, I especially wanted to highlight Marin Ireland because she just did a fabulous job. She really gave each of the characters a distinct voice. And yeah, I just really loved it. So if you need any more encouragement to pick it up, the audiobook is also great. So I have started Shards of Honor by Lois McMaster's Bujold. This is a long-running science fiction series that I have been recommended quite a lot. When I came across Angela's channel, she has just been praising this whole series quite a bit. And so I decided to pick up the first book. One of the things, one of the most striking things I noticed right away was somebody was described as hatchet-faced, and I was like, "What are the chances that," because in Into Thin Air, that was also how it was used to describe someone. Um, so I decided to look up when this book was written, and it was apparently written in 1986. So apparently, it was just cool back in the day to call people hatchet-faced, but no longer. So I'm about 20% of the way in. Basically, we are following this woman, Cordelia. She is on a new planet and she is some sort of biologist. She's collecting specimens, trying to learn about the native flora and fauna on this planet. Her entire crew kind of gets attacked and they have to leave. And she is captured by a person on the other side of this conflict. And yeah, I am noticing, like, there's definitely gonna be a romantic relationship between Cordelia and the man who kidnaps her, which feels a little bit cringy, they're all dirty and sweaty, and they're running for their lives against these, creatures that want to attack, and it's just like, he's so dirty, but I like looking at him." It's just like, that doesn't feel realistic. But I'm liking the characters so far. The other guy, the guy that's captured her was, I think, kind of a victim of a mutiny. He was like a leader, and I think these people kinda just went rogue and tried to kill him and blame it on Cordelia's group, and, so they're teaming up, and they don't know who to trust, and, uh, yeah, it's interesting so far. I will say, like, if it doesn't pick up soon, I may DNF it because the insta love kind of, or insta attraction, I guess, in this situation just kind of makes me uncomfortable. And I've also been told that this series is quite funny, and it's not yet. So, waiting for some funny moments. So, yeah, I will update you when I have read more and have more thoughts. So, hey, it's been a minute since I have last filmed. I have had some pretty hard mental health days. So, that doesn't mean I wasn't reading. I just wasn't filming. So, let me go back to Shards of Honor. I'm having a hard time with Shards of Honor because the insta love is super creepy and weird. This series is like at least 15 books. I didn't expect them to like try and be in a relationship so soon. And it really brings me out of the story. This man, Vorkosigan, is part of this other crew, and they just attacked Cordelia's group, which was a scientist group, and killed one of their people and basically left the other one extremely damaged. And he decides he's going to kidnap her and take her back to his base. The instant attraction just really was weird. Like, he is her kidnapper. Like, I no. And so, anyways, he decides once they get back to the ship and she's kind of met some of the crew, he proposes that they get married instead of, eventually sending her back to her people. They tried to blame it on his culture. They're like, "Oh, am I moving too fast for your culture? Because I've been waiting days to propose marriage for you." And she says, "Days? How long have you been thinking along these lines? Because remember, they've only known each other a handful of days." He says, and I quote, "It occurred to me when I saw you in the ravine." What, throwing up in the mud? He grinned at that with great composure. "By the time we finished burying your officer, I knew." And I'm like, who thinks that's romantic? Like, they were burying a dead body and she threw up because it was so gross. And he's like, gonna propose marriage to that one. Like, I am at 55%. I did keep going. And They still are exhibiting trust like they've known each other for, like, ever, and yeah, I'm not sure if I'm gonna finish this or not because it's really it's a aspect of books that I just really don't enjoy. That's that. I'll either finish it or DNF it. I did read the 5th and final book in this vlog, and I was influenced to pick this up from Ben over at Ben Reads Good. This was on his favorites of the year. And then just a couple weeks later, I saw Hannah talk really highly about it. And so I was really excited to pick it up, especially because it is supposed to be funny. Now, the first thing I'll mention is that the narration was really good. There were 2 narrators, Vanessa Kirby and Arthur Darvill. And if you don't know Arthur Darvill's name, he played Rory on Doctor Who. And I don't think he has a very distinct voice, but it is very pleasant to listen to. So I liked that. So this book is about Andy. Andy has just been dumped by his long-term girlfriend, and he doesn't really understand why. And he is also a stand-up comedian who is not doing very well. And he kind of engages in a bunch of things that make up a good material for a comedy stand-up set. But because Andy doesn't feel like he understands why his girlfriend broke up with him, he says he'll do anything, and he wants to think of time travel. And I thought that was kind of especially meta because Rory was a doctor who was a doctor's companion and did time travel. So anyways, I just really enjoyed that connection. He kind of does some silly things to try and get through this breakup. He hires this really toxic fitness coach. He moves in with this crotchety conspiracy theorist who's also sort of a hoarder, and that makes for some really entertaining stories. And he's kind of pathetic and he's kind of unlikable. Then at the very end, you get the last couple of chapters through the perspective of his ex-girlfriend. You understand why she broke up with him, but you also can see his point of view where it was not one thing. There were a lot of things that were not compatible. So Andy and his ex, Jen, they're in a best friend couple. Their best friends are married to each other. And so they both try to lean on their friends for support. Jen's friend, she decides to treat her to a spa and a forest walk and kind of a get out all your feelings from this breakup and just have supportive friends around, which was awesome. Andy was like, all right, what are you going to do? And he's like, we're going to get beer and alcohol. And I checked to see if Uber Eats will deliver KFC. And he's like, and do they? He's like, yeah. That was his gesture of kindness, was to see if Uber Eats would deliver KFC when they were hungover the next day. Like I said, it's not going to be memorable, but it was a good time, and I'm glad I read it. So that is going to conclude this vlog, except for Shards of Honor. So I will come back one more time and tell you if I finished it and what I thought, or if I couldn't continue. Okay, so did I finish Shards of Honor? The short answer is no. I continued until about 71%, and I was just really not believing these characters. I really hate their insta-love, and I just have loathed the characters. And I thought, oh, I'll just speed up the audiobook and just get through it. But once I realized that I just wanted to hate read it to the end, I thought, no, I'm not going to waste my time. I'm just going to cut my losses here. I really just didn't like the characters. And even Cordelia's mom questioned whether or not Cordelia was brainwashed when she was defending Vorkosigan. They're like, oh, I'm so sorry you were captured by this horrible man. And she defends him. She's like, he's only killed 3 people. And not even the mom was buying it. So yeah, I think this is definitely kind of a me thing. But if you don't like insta-love type stuff, I don't think you'll like it either. I knew early on that I wanted to DNF it, but I felt the same about Cloud Cuckoo Land and ultimately pushed through and thought it was worth it. And I was just thinking that might be the case again, but it wasn't. So sad to end kind of on a downbeat, but I read 4 books I really enjoyed and 1 not so great book. I'm glad I let myself be influenced. Have I influenced you to pick up any of these books? What are you currently reading, and are you loving or hating it? Let's have a chat down in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye.